Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Kriket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
Hello, my constant listener, and welcome back to Shaman's Way. Thank you for joining me. I wanted to talk about the relevancy of shamanism in the 21st century. And I think what inspires me to do this is the talk that I did at the public library, which was this last week, and the conversation was, is shamanism relevant in the 21st century? And the answer in my world is yes. One of the primary functions and focuses for me in practicing shamanism is my ability to look at the world around me and try to figure out how on earth I fit into the big scheme of things. Do I fit into the big scheme of things? What is the big scheme of things, and how does shamanism fit into this? We've talked about shamanism being one of the oldest practices known to humankind. It goes anywhere based on, depending on which anthropological text you read, it goes anywhere from 40,000 to 60,000 years ago. There will be, I know I've said this before, but there will be a discussion in a later podcast regarding the similarities and differences between animism and shamanism, and how many cultures actually practice animism and how many cultures specifically practice shamanism. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to use the term shamanism as it has been accepted, in that shamanism applies to all practices, which include animism. Based on that, the practice in the 21st century, especially in the urban centers, can be challenging for some. Some people are too shy to go out into nature with their drums or their rattles. Some people are afraid of the repercussions of going outside with their drums or their rattles, and that's fair. I can certainly understand that. The other thing that I like about the shamanism in the 21st century isn't that you're afraid to go out inside or outside, but that it gives you an opportunity to connect with nature, both inside the home and outside of the home. You don't necessarily have to take your drum or your rattle or your yoiking into nature where there are a lot of different observers, spectators, people walking by, because I realize that that can be a bit unnerving for some. Personally, however, I've never encountered any challenges or people who are rude or anything along those lines. What I have encountered using my tools and techniques in this day and age is that people are more likely to give me wide breadth than they are to come in narrow with me. The time that I think specifically goes against that or is different from that, we have a group of greenhouses in the river valley in the city where I live called the Mutar Conservatory. And there are 4 specific pyramids that are representative of 4 specific zones. So there's the temperate, the arid, the tropical, and gosh knows, on the future pyramid. But anyway, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is what I call the Earth Temple, or the Earth Pyramid, is the oldest known tree, and it's the Gaia tree. And the very first time that I walked in there, I was overcome by a song and had to sing the song. So I came back with my drum on a number of occasions and have played that song and played my drum to the grandmother tree, to the oldest tree known. And what I usually find, if it's very busy, is that children are fascinated by the song and by the drum. And people have always been very kind and very gracious to let me know that they appreciate what they hear, they like what they've heard, whatever the case is. I think that the opportunity to show sacredness in such a public environment is one of the benefits of practicing shamanism in the 21st century, because we take worship outside of the four walls of the prism of the church, or the four walls of, the cathedral, or the four walls of whatever temple it is. And by bringing this out into the public, I think it creates a certain level of curiosity, one, and two, it really creates, from my perspective, it creates a different relationship. It creates a dialogue. Now, the dialogue may be incredibly short, as it was for me at the Mutard. The dialogues were very short. The questions were very gracious, but there was no follow-up as to, oh, really, what's that? The other aspect of practicing this in the 21st century is that it gives us an opportunity to explore something that we may never be able to explore, whether because we don't have access to family, whether we don't have access to the tribe, whether we don't have access to mental or medical health care. I think that the practice of the shamanic journey is a fundamental part of healing, self-healing, whole healing, bringing ourselves back to wholeness. The ability and the opportunity to use a journey as a method of self-exploration, I think it is a very valuable tool, one which can be utilized in many different respects. So I can use the journey to find out about aspects of my own personality. Where is my abandonment issues? Where are my mother issues coming from? Where are my father issues coming from? There's that aspect of it. The other aspect of the journey work is, how can I find something? So I have found keys that I've lost. I know people have journeyed to find missing people, to find missing objects, to find, along those lines. So using it from the traditional perspective of the shaman being the one who was able to locate missing things or to locate prey. But fundamentally, I think that the most useful and most beneficial aspect of modern shamanism or neo-shamanism really is the practice of self-exploration and the practice of self-healing and the practice of understanding. Comparative mythology has also enabled me to not only understand some of the things that I might see in my journey, they allow me to make a cross-reference. This is what the world tree means here. This is what the world tree means here. Oh, they don't have a world tree here, but they have a mountain, a world mountain here. Or they have Yggdrasil, which, the tree that has every realm and every aspect to it. So those are some of the things that I think are useful and very interesting from the comparative perspective. There are also very interesting clues that can be found in the comparative structure. We can find clues to, how does the psyche operate in this? What does the Papuval say about the beginnings of time? And so the Papuval is the South American, almost would be like their creation story, their creation book. So then what does the Bible say about this creation myth? What do, say, the Dagar people of West Africa? What are their creation myths? And can I find commonalities? Can I find things that are interesting? Can I find things that connect us? So the fact that the wise men that are talked about in the Christian mythology have also shown up as holy people in other births. Two off the top of my head is Siddhartha and Osiris. In those birth stories, we have the wise people who come and who give offerings. So the wise people heralding a birth is actually not that uncommon if it shows up in 5 very, very distinct communities, groups, and stories of mythological beings coming into birth, or holy beings coming into birth, or however you want to however you want to term that. Another aspect of delving into comparative mythology is also delving into analytical psychology and to understand the human psyche. And in understanding the human psyche and enabling us to understand a little bit more about our psyche, when we have the opportunity to journey, when we have the opportunity to move in with a spiritual group or a spiritual understanding of self, we are far more likely to understand what has come through for us if we have some understanding of how we function psychologically. What is an archetype? What is a neuroses? What is borderline personality disorder? What are these things that we talk about? Narcissism is everywhere. Everybody's talking about narcissism. Narcissism. There are so many posts about narcissists. They're on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. So I think it's important to recognize what are those things and how are people determined to be X, Y, Z. I think it's important to understand your depression from a shamanic perspective, from a story perspective. There's a group of stories called The Stone Child that Clarissa Pinkola Estes, I know I'm pronouncing her name wrong, I just like saying it that way. So Clarissa, if you're ever hearing this, which I sincerely doubt you ever will, please school me on your name, but know you are one of my most valued teachers. I love your stories. However, in Stories of the Stone Child, she goes into depth with respect to what it goes through with a child when they've been abandoned, with stories, and she uses an Inuit story to demonstrate how a society deals with a child that has been abandoned, a child that has been abused, a child that believes perhaps that they have no value within the world. I think it's important to look at those groups of stories or those types of stories. There are also very good storytellers and story collectors, art therapists, psychotherapists who have painstakingly gone through the old texts, the old stories, and have painstakingly thought about how women are affected by this. Where did women's power become diminished? What actually does the story of Red Riding Hood, what could it possibly mean from a feminist perspective? Beauty and the Beast, what does it mean from a feminist perspective? What do we look at when we see Bluebeard? How does that affect us from a human perspective? Skeletons in the closet, that comes up in our stories many times. Shapeshifters. Shapeshifters were important because it delineated the difference between a person who had some power and a person who had the ability to literally morph into something else, that shapeshifter. And we have many myths or stories that talk about shapeshifters. But I think we can really apply the shapeshifter to the 21st person, to the 21st century person, in that the shapeshifter is that person who can be from 9 to 5 or 7 to 3 or whatever your hours are, or 7 to 7 if that is how you work. What is that personality there, and does that person shift into somebody else when they come home, and does that person shift again when they come into into a group of friends? The shapeshifter can be that person who comes in and out of your life. We have the abandoning mother, the abandoning father, the abandoning sibling, blah, blah, the abandoning family, that whole story of it. But what we see come from it is, how does a society deal with this? How does a society put together their stories, their psyche, and their healing ceremonies? I think in the 21st century, one of the benefits of working in this day and age are the various types of ceremonies that we can bring in, that we can learn about, that we can incorporate. And they can be quite different depending on which tradition you follow, which tradition is important to you to follow. So if you come from a witch tradition, say you came from a Dianic perspective or a Dianic teaching, you're going to have a very different viewpoint with respect to the journeys that perhaps a person who comes from Burkina Faso and who has worked distinctively with the Dagara traditions, the traditions of Burkina Faso, they're going to have a very different relationship to ceremony and to ritual because it's been part of their evolution of soul as they grew up, versus a person who has picked it up on their own when they're 13 and now are 40 and are still beginning to practice or still practicing. Ceremony and ritual, how many times have you run across articles? How many YouTube channels can you find that talk about ceremony or show ritual? It is absolutely invaluable from my perspective to become very attached or expressing of a outcome. So we have a desired outcome. A desired outcome for a friend of mine this week is that when he goes through his evaluations with his new boss, that everything goes well. So from my end, what I would do in a small ceremony, it's not a ritual, but it's a small ceremony because there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in ritual, there's a beginning and there may be somewhat of a middle, but we have no idea where something ends. So the ceremony, from my perspective, is that which has an unmovable or an almost unmovable structure to it, where a ritual has some structure and then lots of moving parts to it as well. So for this gentleman, I would perform a small ceremony for him, and I have a little doll that can be made masculine or feminine, and you can also think these things too. Like you don't have to have a gender specific doll because many of us don't specifically adhere to one gender or another. So there's that aspect. So I would put a human form in the center. What I generally do is I generally will put however many moons. So we are in the full moon today because I am recording this on a full moon. So I would have one moon at the top and one moon at the bottom, and that would be a half moon cycle. So I would have a full moon here and a new moon here, and by the time that the new moon came about 2 weeks later, he would have perfect resolution or perfect understanding. Another thing that I might do in order to draw good luck is I may put stones around the human figure, but then what I'll do is I will put sand or other small stones leading into the center so everything can lead in, everything can lead out. So power in, power out, blessings in, blessings out, that sort of thing, so that you have a movable energy center, so to speak. I am a candle person. I love my fire, so I would have candles in the 4 directions unless I was specifically asking for something from one of the directions. So using ceremony, I'm not going to continue on and tell you all the little bits and pieces because I certainly don't want to bore you. But I think that it is important and invaluable in this day and age that we have the opportunity to incorporate the things which are going to make us happy. We have the opportunity to incorporate the things which are relevant and meaningful for us. So where you may find it relevant and meaningful to use 20 pounds of stones and crystals, that's not my reality. My reality would be to use only the number that I have for that specific thing. It's also how many people will say prayers. I say prayers to the 4 directions, and then I say prayers imploring the elements to hear my prayer, to listen to my words, to change what's going on, those sorts of things. So I take that very much into consideration too. Taking the practice into this time and this age also gives us, as you can see behind me, are 2 drums. This is what I consider to be a water drum, not because it is a water drum, but because it likes water and it doesn't seem to go flat when it is really, really moist out. And this drum here is my oldest drum, and it is going to be 23 on March 18th. And this is my favorite drum. I'm going to cover myself up for a minute. And the person who made it for me was the first person that I studied shamanism with. And for my 30th birthday, he gave this drum and gave me care and control of the drumming circle. That's how I always know how old it is, because on the 30th birthday. Actually, it was on just a few days before my birthday. So this drum is a very valuable part of my relationship to the spirit world in this day and age, because first of all, I have a long-term relationship with it. I have many drums on here. I have many journeys on here. I have had the opportunity to do many types of healings with this drum. So in the 21st century, how has it inspired me? It's inspired me to use an ancient tool in a modern way. Just because we don't live in the time of our ancestors doesn't mean that aspects or roles or behavior patterns of our ancestors can't have a very specific effect on us. When I have a person laying down on the healing bed, which is what this is here, when I have a person laying down on my healing bed, I like to use the drum and I like it to play it very close to the person's body. And I have different types of drums that have different kinds of sounds. So depending on what I want to achieve with that drum. So for this drum, it's a healing drum. So if you came in with a fractured heart or cancer, or many of those other things where we might feel that the soil of the soul needs to be put back together, then I would use this drum. If I felt that you had too much fire in your body and you didn't have enough moisture, then I would use the water drum behind me. If I felt that you needed long, really deep reverberations and you needed a reverberation to go on for a long time after the drum had been struck, I would use one of my other drums that has a Remo head, and they're all sound so incredibly different. So I use each of them in different healing ways. So this drum and that drum and the other drum, and the rattles that I use come in shapes of various sizes. So I have rattles that are, approximately 2.5 to 3 inches in diameter, and that are very, very quiet. So after some healing work, what I do with the light rattle is I'll rattle very gently around the person, because the person may be very sensitive to sound, may be very sensitive to the vibrations of a rattle. So I use something very, very gentle. Not everybody also likes rattles. If I'm in a big circle or if I need big energy, then I have rattles that are also very large and that make a big sound. So I like to have things in various sounds because I think sound is absolutely invaluable in this work. I think that in using shamanism, neo-shamanism in the 21st century, we're also really moving to, to use a cliche, moving to the beat of your own drum, because you are truly moving to the beat of your own drum. And if you're moving to the beat of your own drum, then it just stands to reason, and I'm using a pun, obviously, but it stands to reason that you are going to be able to, or have access to, or can engage different ways of expressing yourself. The voice is very important. So if I'm doing ceremony, if I'm doing a healing, I do a lot of prayer, and I do a lot of impromptu prayer. And I may be using prayer different from how you use the word prayer. Usually if I'm sitting alone and I'm doing my half-hour prayers prior to anybody coming to the house for healing work, then I'll go very quietly. And prayer is that direct relationship between divine and self, bypassing the intellect. Verbal prayer is very much like that for me. I'm bypassing the intellect, and I am very open to using no script. I can use a script if I have to, but because I come from a ritual background and not a ceremony background, I like the impromptu words. I like the impromptu feelings. I like the impromptu abilities that you have with the voice. So if I'm using this drum over top of somebody a healing song might come. If I'm using the water drum, then I would sing my water song. Or it may ask me to sing something incredibly gentle and tender, because each body has its own song. Each body has its own rhythm. Each body is in and of itself a unit that operates very similarly to other people's, but we have our own vibration, we have our own aura, we have our own relationship to that which is outside of self, that which is not of self. So in that relationship, I try to hear what the sounds are that the spirit would need. The other part that I think is important to recognize is that we, for the first time in our history, are able to write books from and read articles and listen to podcasts and watch videos from people who have many different perspectives. Some of the perspectives I certainly would not utilize as my own. Some of the perspectives I find very interesting and very illuminating and very deep. I think that we came from a group of people who very often didn't go further than 5 miles or 3 miles from their home their entire life. And now we have the ability via the magical internet to be able to research, read, interview people from many different cultures, many different backgrounds who are attempting to understand and repatriate almost their own traditions and their own uses, their own belief structures, their own ceremonies, their own language. Even saving their own language has become very important in many nations. Even the First Nations in Canada, there are many that are attempting to save their language, especially some of the very smaller tribes and smaller groups. To encapsulate everything, I think that shamanism, although used in many different forms by our ancestors, I think the practice of neo-shamanism, if we're going to be, correct in our technicalities, the use of neo-shamanism provides you with so many avenues for self-discovery, for self-healing, for understanding of self, that you cannot really go wrong. You have a tool, which is the trance, through the drum, the voice, the rattle, whatever you wish to use, that helps to augment the mind. And when we help to augment or shift the mind, then we also, if we change our perceptions, we change how we see. If we change how we see, we change what we see. That's my belief anyway. And the exploration of the self can never be undervalued, I think would be a good way to put it. Never be undervalued. I think that although we are obsessed with navel gazing, and because we have time on our hands, we actually can contemplate many different aspects of the world, many different parts of the world, many different things that we couldn't contemplate if we were just on a subsistence and trying to survive without any education and working 18 hours a day for, pennies, literally. So in my position, I recognize how very privileged I have it that I can do this self-exploration. I think it is invaluable to explore the self and understand the self and make yourself more responsible for how you move from one direction to the other direction, from one way of being to the other way of being. And that is it for today. So thank you, my constant listener, for your wonderful time, your wonderful attention, and I look forward to meeting you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for joining us here on the Shaman's Way podcast. If you have any questions, would like to make a request for a future episode, or if you're looking for other shamanic resources, including free drumming tracks, please visit us at shamansway.net. Until the next episode, be well, everyone.